Imagine an empire that, for centuries, was a symbol of order, glory, and wisdom. Now, imagine that same empire slowly being dragged into the abyss, not by an external enemy, but by the hands of the emperor himself. This is the story of Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. A man revered for his stoic philosophy and just leadership, Commodus was born with his destiny already written, to rule Rome and preserve a golden legacy. But what he did with that legacy is what shocks even the most skeptical historians, because Commodus didn't just fail to follow in his father's footsteps, he obliterated the entire path. His reign was the turning point, a watershed moment between virtuous Rome and corrupt Rome, between an empire that conquered the world with discipline, and one that became ashamed of its own throne. The signs were there early on: hushed-up scandals, fits of rage, a taste for public humiliation. But what came next exceeded all known limits. He wasn't just cruel, he was unpredictable. And if you think this story is just about sexual excess or gratuitous violence, think again. Commodus's depravity spread through every corner of imperial administration. No one was spared. Not the people, not the Senate, not even the gods themselves. Why did he do all this? Was it madness, vanity, a macabre plan for absolute power, or perhaps a void that even the greatest empire on earth couldn't fill? In the next few minutes, you'll discover the 10 reasons that made Commodus the most depraved and negligent emperor in all of Roman history. Commodus was an heir raised to reign or to destroy. He wasn't a fluke of fate. He was shaped to rule, the first emperor born during his own father's reign. A living symbol of imperial continuity. From childhood, he bore on his shoulders the weight and expectations of all Rome. But instead of forging a leader, the empire raised a tyrant. Marcus Aurelius, his father, believed in the power of reason. He chose renowned teachers to educate his heir. One of them, none other than Galen, the greatest physician of antiquity, a genius of science and philosophy. With him, Commodus learned about the human body, and perhaps in a perverse way also how to inflict pain on it. Even before reaching puberty, Commodus was flaunting titles that seasoned men took decades to earn. He was named consul at just 15 years old. In the eyes of the people, he was a prodigy. But within the palace walls, another truth was unfolding, a darker one. While his tutors spoke of ethics, Commodus amused himself by torturing slaves. While they preached self-control, he imposed brutal punishments on anyone who looked at him the wrong way or disagreed with his childish whims. There was no patience or empathy, only the pleasure of commanding and punishing. It was as if, inside that young aristocratic face, something was already broken, an emotional void that could only be filled with the pain of others. For him, authority was never a responsibility. It was always a weapon. And the most frightening part, all of this happened before he even became emperor. The boy who was meant to be the continuation of Marcus Aurelius would soon prove to be his complete opposite. Among the many disturbing traits of Commodus, there was one that stirred unease even among those who lived in the shadow of the throne: his obsession with suffering. From a very young age, he showed an unusual fascination with wounds, blood, and physical pain, not as something to be healed, but as something to be watched, and worse still, as something to be caused. Educated by none other than Galen, the greatest physician of antiquity, Commodus had access to knowledge that few Romans could even dream of understanding: anatomy, physiology, the workings of the human body. But while Galen saw science and healing, Commodus seemed to see something else, a kind of dark curiosity that blurred into pleasure. During palace spectacles, he liked to watch the wounded gladiators up close. He ordered that they be left to agonize longer before receiving help. He would observe the movements of their twisted bodies, as if analyzing what each muscle did in extreme pain. And he claimed he was learning. The most unsettling part is that all of this seems to have emerged after the death of his twin brother, Titus. During childhood, it was a silent trauma, an invisible wound that never healed. Many historians believe that this early loss shaped part of his emotional coldness, as if death had left a permanent crack in his mind. Over time, his fascination with pain became constant. In the palace halls, he spoke of anatomy as casually as others discussed battles. And while there are no records confirming that he ever wielded scalpels like a physician, he treated human suffering as something that amused him, that entertained him. It was as if life for Commodus was nothing more than a stage, and blood a part of the show. But Rome's true collapse under Commodus didn't happen in the palace corridors. It happened in the absence, in the silence of a throne that, though occupied, was completely void of responsibility. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the empire expected the continuation of his legacy. But what it received was the most blatant disregard an emperor had ever shown for his own duty. Commodus didn't want to govern. For him, sitting on the throne wasn't a calling. It was a nuisance. Instead of leading, he handed the reins of the empire to a string of incompetent, sycophantic, and corrupt favorites, men like Perennis and Cleander, who amassed positions and wealth while Rome sank into disorder. They sold offices, manipulated trials, persecuted opponents, all under the bored gaze of an emperor who simply didn't care. Commodus had turned the empire into a luxury toy. He spent his days in aromatic baths and endless banquets, surrounded by concubines, musicians, and flatterers. At night, he indulged in private parties that exceeded all limits of decency. Orgies, obscene spectacles, gambling, and nocturnal hunts in the imperial gardens themselves. There was more wine than water, and more lust than law. But make no mistake, this wasn't just negligence. It was an active rejection of the imperial role. Commodus chose to abandon Rome. He chose to turn his back on an empire threatened at its borders, pressured by enemies, and plagued by internal crises. While generals fought to keep the provinces standing, the emperor concerned himself with perfumes, costumes, and new forms of entertainment. It was as if, when faced with responsibility, he simply said, "I don't care." And it was precisely in this brutal contrast between the empire Marcus Aurelius built and the one Commodus destroyed that a question began to echo. How did such a grand empire reach this point? To understand that, we dive into a work that goes far beyond dates and names, a true epic of ancient civilization, the history of the ancient world. From the earliest accounts to the fall of Rome, this book was one of the main inspirations for this video. With an engaging and detailed narrative, it reconstructs the birth, peak, and collapse of Rome, revealing the backstage, the dilemmas, and the decisions that shaped the destiny of the world. If you want to go beyond this video and understand how the most powerful empire of antiquity fell into the hands of a madman like Commodus, the link to the ebook is in the description. A must-read for anyone passionate about history. Back to the video. Rome, for centuries, had been supported by ambitious and disciplined leaders, and now it was in the hands of a hedonist, a man who traded the glory of the empire for the pleasures of a harem. Moreover, Commodus's self-destruction didn't stop at parties and disdain for governance. It went further, silently and corrosively, to the very heart of what sustained Rome, its economy. For centuries, the empire had built an administrative machine based on fiscal discipline and the real value of its currency. The gold aureus and silver denarius symbolized not just wealth, but the stability of the Roman world. These were coins that circulated across 3 continents, respected in every conquered corner, until Commodus laid his hands on them. To maintain his life of luxury, he needed money, a lot of money, more than the imperial treasury could provide. So he made a fatal decision. He began to devalue gold and silver coins by mixing in cheaper metals. It was like diluting wine with dirty water and selling it as pure, a silent blow almost imperceptible at first, but devastating over time. This money didn't fund reforms or public works. It paid for palace orgies, private parties, exotic hunts, and bloody spectacles at the Colosseum. Rome watched in disbelief as an emperor squandered the equivalent of imperial fortunes on dinners with 100 courses and foreign dancers brought in on private ships. And there was more. Part of this money was used to buy loyalty. Commodus paid high salaries and generous bonuses to the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, not for merit, but out of fear of losing his luxuries and privileges. The result was a gradual and invisible collapse. Inflation skyrocketed, and purchasing power plummeted. The provinces began to suffer from shortages, and the people who once trusted in the value of the denarius as a symbol of security came to see it as nothing more than a worthless piece of metal. Commodus wasn't just a hedonist lost in pleasure. He was also a strategist of chaos, a master of popular manipulation, and what he lacked in administrative competence, he made up for with spectacle. He knew that to keep the throne, all he had to do was keep the people entertained and the Senate silenced. Thus began a wave of populist propaganda unlike anything Rome had ever seen. He distributed coins to citizens during festivals, held free games, chariot races, public executions, and mass banquets. He filled the Colosseum with bread and circuses, buying not only silence but applause. But behind the Golden Curtain, there was a cold, calculated political move. Commodus deliberately inverted Rome's traditional values. Instead of exalting the Senate, he publicly scorned it. He declared that the people came before the elite, and while he inflamed the crowds with promises and gifts, he drained power from the senators, magistrates, and councils. And the next fact will leave you even more incredulous. After years of feeding his public image with carefully staged exaggerations and lies, Commodus took things a step further. In 190 AD, Commodus declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, yes, the Greek demigod son of Zeus. And to prove he meant it, he began appearing in public dressed as Hercules himself, wearing a lion's skin over his shoulders, holding a carved wooden club as if it were a sacred weapon. Sources and historians like Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta suggest that he truly confused myth with reality and genuinely believed himself to be the new Hercules. He ordered the Senate to recognize him as Roman Hercules, the new son of Jupiter, and Rome obeyed. Statues were erected in his honor throughout the city, even in the oldest and most respected temples. Places once reserved only for the gods, coins began to bear his image as if he were already a consecrated deity. His official titles multiplied: Dominus, Invictus, Unconquered. His vanity had surpassed all human limits, and what should have been grand became pathetic. And the craziest part of all this I'll show you in the next curiosity. Commodus also wanted something no other emperor dared to become: a gladiator. Yes, Commodus, the most powerful man in the world, stepped into the Colosseum arena to fight. He dressed as the demigod he claimed to be. Lion skin over his shoulders, golden club in hand, muscles exposed, and a triumphant gaze. But what happened there wasn't heroism. It was theater mixed with real blood. His opponents were always carefully chosen. Weak, inexperienced, submissive adversaries. He also fought against caged or controlled animals. Lions, ostriches, even elephants, all killed with arrows or spears in battles that posed little risk to the emperor. And the best part, he charged for it. Each of his appearances cost the public treasury a fortune, sums that could have funded armies or supplied entire provinces, but they were spent solely to satisfy an inflated ego that fed on applause and death. The Roman elite, horrified, watched as the throne was lowered to the level of the blood-stained sand, because a gladiator in the Roman social scale was a slave. And seeing the emperor assume that role was not seen as courage by most, it was disgrace. Absolute power and his madness extended beyond the Roman Empire. Not even marriage escaped Commodus's tyranny. At 16, he officially married Brutia Crispina, a young woman from the Roman aristocracy. The marriage was strategic, like so many noble unions, sealing alliances and reinforcing imperial legitimacy. For a time, she was seen at the emperor's side, as his wife and empress. But as the years passed, the relationship grew cold. Brutia bore him no children, and soon Commodus grew tired of her. In 191 AD, Brutia was exiled to the island of Capri. The accusation? Adultery. Shortly after, she was executed, possibly on Commodus's direct order. The true reasons for her downfall were never fully clarified. Some say the adultery was fabricated. Others claim that the lack of heirs caused dissatisfaction. But one thing is certain: around Commodus, no one was indispensable, not even the woman who once shared the throne with him. As Crispina vanished from history, another figure rose to prominence. Marcia, the emperor's official mistress. More than a concubine, she was a counselor, influential and astute. She knew how to play the game of power and kept Commodus entertained and compliant. Though she was never formally crowned, she enjoyed privileges that even legitimate empresses did not. Commodus wanted her at the center of the palace, to be recognized. And if the title of empress didn't come by decree, it came in practice through influence, wealth, and control over the empire's inner workings. Over time, dressing and being recognized as a god was no longer enough. Commodus now wanted to reshape the entire world in his image. According to the historian Herodian, in 192 AD, at the height of his delusion, he decreed that the Eternal City, the cradle of Western civilization, would no longer be called Rome. From that moment on, it would be known as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He also decreed that all citizens would henceforth be called Commodianus, as if every soul breathing under the Roman sky was merely an extension of his ego. The people were no longer Roman, they were his. As the historian Cassius Dio also recounts, he renamed the months of the year, giving each one of them his own titles: Lucius, Aelius, Commodus, Hercules Romanus. Even the calendar now revolved around his name. He renamed the Senate, transforming it into the Commodian Senate. He changed the names of the army, the palaces, public buildings. Any traditional symbol that reminded people of Rome's former grandeur was erased or distorted. These acts weren't just the whims of a spoiled tyrant. They were a direct symbolic attack on the very memory of Rome. These seemingly absurd gestures were, in fact, the crowning of his symbolic tyranny. He didn't just want to rule. He wanted to erase Rome and rewrite it with his own signature. Never in the history of the empire had anyone dared so much. Not Caligula, not Nero, not any of the others who had come before. According to Herodian, Commodus planned to begin the year 193 AD with a public ceremony in which he would officially present himself as the new founder of Rome, renaming the city and proclaiming a new era bearing his name. But while he was preparing for eternal glory, 3 people close to him were plotting his end. Sources such as Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta mention that Marcia, his mistress, along with Quintus Aemilius Laetus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, and Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain, discovered that Commodus had included them on an execution list. They then conspired to kill him that very night. Marcia offered Commodus a glass of wine laced with poison. He drank it, but, according to the accounts, vomited the contents shortly afterward, perhaps out of suspicion or by chance. The plan seemed to have failed, so they called Narcissus, the emperor's personal trainer, a trusted man, familiar with Commodus's physical strength he could still use even in a dazed state. Narcissus quietly entered the imperial chambers and did what the poison could not. He strangled Commodus with his own hands. Commodus wasn't just a corrupt emperor. He was the embodiment of what happens when power loses all boundaries. Immediately after his assassination, the Senate acted with fury. They declared him an enemy of the state, removed his name from statues, burned his decrees, and erased his titles. It was as if they were trying to eradicate the nightmare itself, a desperate attempt to restore dignity to a throne stained by madness. But the empire was complex, and politics even more so. Shortly afterward, the new emperor, seeking to guarantee stability, rehabilitated Commodus, and, in an even more unbelievable move, he was deified. Yes, that same man who renamed Rome, who fought dwarfs in the Colosseum, who murdered his wife and dressed as Hercules, was now officially a god in the Roman pantheon. And now, I ask you, what do you think was the most absurd moment of Commodus's reign? Leave a comment down below. I really want to hear your opinion. If you found this content interesting and learned something new, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And don't forget to check out the full documentary we made about the Third Punic War. Just click the screen and watch.